Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, for decades we have been told a simple story that the United States, as the benevolent architect of the global order, would guide nations towards liberal democracy and free market prosperity. Any challenger to this hegemony would be contained, or worse, collapse under the weight of its own inefficiencies. This was the unipolar script. But today, I stand before you to argue that we are witnessing the shredding of that script. The title of our discussion is not a prediction. It is an observation of a process already in motion. Collapse as U.S. economic war on China backfires. What we are seeing is not the collapse of China, but the collapse of a strategy of containment that is fundamentally incompatible with the interconnected, multipolar reality of the 21st century. Consider for a moment the fundamental nature of a siege. The classical objective is to encircle, to cut off supply lines, and to wait for the inevitable collapse of those inside from starvation and despair. This is the logic that has underpinned the strategy of economic containment wielded against China, a modern day siege intended to starve not a city, but a nation of the technological oxygen required for growth in the 21st century. The sanctions the entity lists, the deliberate decoupling from advanced semiconductor supply chains, these were not merely trade disputes, they were the deliberate construction of a high-tech wall. The architects of this containment believed they were building a cage, confident that the occupant within would eventually be subdued by their own technological inferiority. This was a profound miscalculation, a failure to understand the dynamic psychology of a sovereign civilization, state with a historical memory measured in millennia, not centuries. What has been revealed, in stark contrast to the intended outcome, is that the most potent catalyst for innovation is not the promise of reward, but the existential imperative of survival. When access to external technology is systematically denied, the choice is not between dependency and autonomy, it is between autonomy and oblivion. This is the powerful transformative force that has been unleashed. The narrative of containment presupposes a passive actor, one that will simply accept its designated place in a hierarchy dictated from abroad. But China, facing what it perceives as an existential threat to its developmental model and its great power status, did not behave passively. The restrictions on companies like Huawei, intended to be a death blow, became a brutal but effective national mandate. The message was unequivocal. Every single component, every line of code, every architectural design that could no longer be sourced from abroad had to be developed domestically, and it had to be done not in a generation, but in years. This triggered a mobilization of financial, intellectual, and human capital on a scale perhaps unseen in peacetime history. Vast sums of state and private capital were funneled into semiconductor research, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The Made in China 2025 policy, once viewed as an ambitious roadmap, was suddenly accelerated into an urgent survival guide. The cage, therefore, did not contain, it concentrated the mind. It forced a focus on indigenous capability that may otherwise have been delayed by the convenience and efficiency of global supply chains. Why invest billions in a risky, decade-long project to create a domestic chip fabrication plant when you can simply purchase the world's best from Taiwan or South Korea? The answer, delivered by the force of geopolitical conflict, is that strategic security trumps economic efficiency. This is the great backfire. The sanctions forced China to prioritize long-term strategic resilience over short-term economic optimization. The very areas targeted for weakness are now the subjects of the most intense investment and national focus. We are witnessing the rapid development of a parallel technological ecosystem, from alternative mobile operating systems to cloud infrastructures and semiconductor lithography machines. This is not to claim the journey will be easy or immediate. The technological gaps in areas like extreme ultraviolet lithography are formidable. However, the direction of travel is now unalterable. The West has effectively abdicated its role as a competitor in the Chinese market, creating a protected vacuum where domestic champions can mature, iterate, and scale without foreign competition. This is the paradox of the technological cage. By attempting to lock China out, the West has inadvertently locked itself out of the largest market in the world, granting Chinese firms a monopoly by default. The catalyst effect extends beyond mere imitation. It fosters a unique innovation pathway. When you are not bound by the legacy systems and intellectual property frameworks of the incumbent powers, you are free to leapfrog. China's advancements in digital currency, for example, or its application of 5G technology are not merely copies. They are adaptations and evolutions suited to its own societal structure. The cage, therefore, has not just spurred innovation, but a specific kind of sovereign innovation, a technological trajectory that is increasingly distinct from and competitive with the Western model. The ultimate failure of the containment strategy lies in this fundamental misreading of human and national psychology. Pressure, when applied to a resilient and capable entity, does not cause collapse. It forges resilience into hardened strength. The wall built to contain has become the climbing wall upon which China is building the muscles for a technological future that is increasingly its own. The architecture of American primacy in the post-Cold War era was built on a foundation of unparalleled financial dominance, with the U.S. dollar serving as the indispensable pillar of global commerce and the primary reserve asset for nations worldwide. This was not merely an economic convenience. It was the central nervous system of the liberal international order, a system that conferred upon the United States what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously termed the exorbitant privilege. For decades, this privilege was maintained through a tacit bargain. The world would use the dollar, and in return, the United States would act as a responsible steward of the global economy, providing liquidity and stability. However, a profound and potentially irreversible shift has occurred. The weaponization of this financial infrastructure has shattered the implicit trust upon which the entire system was built. The very tools designed to project power in the short term are systematically dismantling the foundation of long-term hegemony, turning the ultimate symbol of American strength in its most glaring strategic vulnerability. This is the essence of the backfire. You cannot simultaneously be the reliable custodian of a global commons and its primary predator. When the United States made the strategic decision to leverage its control over global payment systems like SEP2FT and to freeze a nation's sovereign assets, actions taken with increasing frequency against states deemed adversarial, it crossed a Rubicon from which there is no return. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that the global financial system is not a neutral platform for commerce, but a potent instrument of foreign policy, one that can be activated with the stroke of a pen in Washington. The immediate objective may have been to inflict maximum economic pain on a specific target, but the secondary, far more consequential effect was to send a seismic shockwave through the corridors of power in every capital, from Beijing to Brasilia, from Riyadh to New Delhi. The message received was unambiguous. If it can happen to them, it can happen to us. This realization is the genesis of what can only be described as a global movement towards risking from the dollar-centric system, not out of ideological animosity, but out of a primal instinct for strategic survival. No sovereign state can accept a reality where its economic viability is held hostage to the political whims of another power. This awakening is not a theoretical discussion. It is manifesting in concrete, tangible actions that are incrementally eroding the dollar's monopoly. The rapid expansion of bilateral currency swap agreements between China and a multitude of partners, the concerted efforts within the Backfires framework to develop an alternative payment messaging system, and the increasing willingness of major commodity exporters like Saudi Arabia to entertain transactions in currencies other than the dollar. These are not isolated anomalies, but symptoms of a systemic breakdown in confidence. Each transaction conducted in yuan, rubles, or rupees is a small but deliberate vote against the existing order. It represents a conscious effort by nations to build financial firebreaks, creating parallel systems that can be activated should they themselves fall out of political favor with Washington. This is the ultimate strategic blunder. By using financial power to punish, the United States has incentivized the entire world to find ways to circumvent that very power. The weapon only works if everyone agrees to stand in front of it. Once they start building shields, or worse, crafting their own weapons, its efficacy diminishes rapidly. The trajectory this sets is towards a fragmented, multi-currency financial world, a direct and inevitable consequence of treating a global public good as a private weapon. The exorbitant privilege is not a divine right. It is a function of consensus. That consensus is now broken. The United States is thus caught in a paradox of its own, making the more aggressively it wields its financial weapons to maintain control in the short term, the faster it accelerates the emergence of a decentralized financial order that will fundamentally undermine its long-term global leadership. The pillar of its power is becoming the source of its decline, not because of an external defeat, but through a series of self-inflicted wounds. The world is not abandoning the dollar because it has found a better alternative overnight. It is diversifying because the United States has proven to be an unreliable and coercive custodian. In the grand calculus of geopolitics, the temporary satisfaction of punishing an adversary pales in comparison to a permanent loss of trust that serves as the bedrock of true enduring power. The weapon has been turned inward, and the unraveling has begun. The defining geopolitical struggle of the 21st century is often mischaracterized as a new Cold War, a simplistic binary contest between two opposing spheres of influence vying for global dominance. This framing, however seductive in its clarity, is dangerously obsolete. It is a relic of a bygone unipolar era, a mental model imposed upon a world that has fundamentally and irreversibly moved on. The true paradigm shift, the central dynamic that Washington's foreign policy establishment has so profoundly misread, is the assertive rise of strategic autonomy. Nations are no longer willing to be passive actors on a chessboard designed and controlled by others. They are increasingly the players themselves, and their overarching objective is not to choose a side, but to master the space between them. The relentless pressure to align unequivocally with a US-led bloc against China or Russia is not producing a coalition of the willing. It is forging a coalition of the calculating, a diverse group of states united by a shared determination to evade the suffocating embrace of a binary choice and to reclaim their sovereign right to define their own national interests. This is not an abstract theory, it is the daily reality of statecraft for powers from New Delhi to Ankara, from Brasilia to Berlin. For these nations, the primary strategic imperative is not the triumph of one hegemon over another, but the preservation of their own agency in a world of competing giants. The calculus is one of sophisticated balance, not blind allegiance. Why should India, with its vast developmental needs and its own great power aspirations, sever its deeply entrenched military ties with Russia or forego access to affordable Russian energy simply to fit into a US strategy of containment? Its refusal to do so is not pro-Russian, it is pro-Indian. Similarly, Germany's existential dependence on trade with China for its industrial base creates a fundamental tension with any foreign policy that demands economic decoupling. For middle powers and rising economies, entanglement with both competing blocs is not a sign of moral ambiguity, it is the essence of pragmatic statecraft. It provides leverage, creates options, and insulates them from the coercive power that either pole can wield against a dependent ally or vassal. This is the art of the great balancing act, and it represents the highest form of strategic intelligence in a fragmented world. The US-led push for a binary alignment, therefore, has produced a result that is the exact opposite of its intention. By forcing nations to choose, it has made the costs of alignment painfully clear while simultaneously highlighting the benefits of non-alignment. This dynamic is most visible across the global south, where the language of a rules-based order is increasingly viewed as a thinly veiled justification for a US-centric order. The attempt to isolate Russia over Ukraine, for instance, failed spectacularly to achieve a global consensus because a significant majority of the world's population saw the conflict not as a moral crusade, but as a great power conflict in which they had no stake and from which they sought to remain apart. Their neutrality is a strategic asset, one they are prepared to use. They will engage with Western institutions when it is beneficial, but they will simultaneously deepen ties with China's Belt and Road Initiative, participate in Russia-led security frameworks, and strengthen intra-Backfires cooperation. This is not neutrality, it is multi-alignment. It is a conscious strategy to diversify dependencies, to play competing suitors against one another, and to extract maximum economic and strategic benefit from a competitive international landscape. The ultimate failure of the binary framework is that it misunderstands the very nature of power in a networked world. In a binary system, power is a zero-sum game. What one block gains, the other loses. But for the balancers, power is additive. Their influence grows precisely by cultivating relationships with all sides, by becoming indispensable nodes in multiple networks. They become the swing states, the crucial partners, the mediators whose allegiance cannot be taken for granted and must, therefore, be constantly courted. The United States, by insisting on a with us or against us doctrine, is effectively ceding this immense strategic space to its competitors. It is telling these nations that their complex, interest-driven foreign policy is illegitimate, thereby pushing them away. In doing so, it is not just losing allies, it is actively creating a world of strategic orphans who, finding the door to one house locked, will inevitably build a new and more accommodating neighborhood of their own. The future global order will not be defined by which bloc wins, but by how skillfully the balancers navigate the tensions between them to shape a system that is truly and resiliently multipolar. The most perilous moment in international affairs arrives not when a strategy fails, but when its failure becomes undeniable to all except its architects. We are living through such a moment. The persistent pursuit of a containment strategy against an integrated major power like China represents a case study in strategic hubris, a dangerous anachronism being played out on the global stage with the devastating consequences. The fundamental error lies in a misdiagnosis of the patient. The tools designed to pressure a relatively isolated, economically weaker Soviet Union are being applied to the world's foremost manufacturing and trading nation, the central node in the complex web of global supply chains. This is not merely a tactical blunder, it is a category error of historic proportions, and its repercussions are not confined to the target. They are recoiling back upon the originator with gathering force, offering a masterclass in the laws of geopolitical physics that govern our interconnected age. To ignore this backfire is to willingly steer into a storm blindfolded. The core lesson, which the architects of containment seem determined to avoid learning, is that in a globalized economy, aggression against a major economic power is an act of profound self-harm. The theory of containment relies on the ability to isolate, to build economic walls that cause the target to stagnate and collapse inward. But when the target is not an insular empire, but the workshop of the world, these walls do not merely enclose China, they fracture the global economic system itself. The tariffs intended to punish Chinese industry function as a regressive tax on American consumers and businesses, fueling inflation and eroding competitiveness. The sanctions designed to cripple China's tech sector disrupt supply chains for everything from automobiles to consumer electronics, creating shortages and delays that ripple back to cripple Western industries. This is the first and most immediate lesson of the backfire. In a hyper-connected system, there is no such thing as a surgical strike against a major economy. Every blow landed creates a shockwave that travels back through the network, damaging the assailant. The United States is discovering that it is not outside the system administering punishment, but is rather an deeply embedded node within it, vulnerable to the very disruptions it seeks to cause. This dynamic extends far beyond simple economic blowback into the realm of grand strategy, where the unintended consequences are even more profound. The primary strategic goal of U.S. policy has been to rally a coalition of democratic allies to present a united front against China's rise. Yet, the methods employed to enforce this unity, the pressure to decouple, the demands to exclude Chinese technology like Huawei from critical infrastructure have themselves become a source of friction and division within the very alliance system they are meant to strengthen. European nations, with their deep economic ties to the Chinese market, view aggressive decoupling not as a strategic necessity but as an economic suicide pact dictated by Washington. They see the Inflation Reduction Act not as a bold climate initiative but as a predatory, America First industrial policy that subsidizes U.S. companies at the direct expense of European competitors. The attempt to consolidate a bloc is paradoxically straining the transatlantic relationship, revealing a fundamental divergence of interests between the United States, which can contemplate a Cold War-style standoff, and Europe, for which such a conflict would be economically catastrophic. The backfire here is the erosion of alliance cohesion, as secondary partners are forced to choose between their economic well-being and their strategic alignment. The most significant lesson is that the strategy itself is accelerating the emergence of the very multipolar world it was designed to prevent. By demonstrating the perils of over-reliance on the U.S.-led financial and technological ecosystem, Washington has gifted Beijing and Moscow a powerful narrative to rally the global South. Every sanction, every tariff, every act of technological blacklisting is used as evidence that the United States is an unreliable hegemon that will weaponize its dominance against any nation that challenges its primacy. This does not necessarily make other countries pro-China, but it makes them intensely anti-coercion, and it drives them to build alternative institutions, from bare access to currency swap networks, that dilute American power. The containment strategy, therefore, is not containing China's influence, it is proliferating it by making the case for a post-American world more compelling with every punitive measure. The great tragedy is that this is not a lesson that must be theorized, it is one that is being demonstrated in real time. The data is in, the evidence is clear. The only question that remains is whether there is the intellectual courage and strategic humility to acknowledge the backfire and change course before the structural damage becomes irreversible. The unipolar moment, that brief and historically anomalous period when a single power could claim to set the agenda for our international system, has passed into history. Its passing is not a cause for lament, but a clarion call for a new generation of strategic thinking, particularly for the nations long relegated to the periphery of great power politics. This is not the twilight of influence for the middle powers and the rising states of the global South. It is their dawn. For decades, their foreign policy was often constrained, a delicate dance within a framework designed by and for others. Their choices limited by the overwhelming gravitational pull of a single superpower. Today, that gravitational field is weakening, and in the resulting strategic flux, a historic opportunity has been forged. The great powers, increasingly preoccupied with their direct rivalry, are overextended, their attention and resources absorbed by a zero-sum competition that creates space, leverage, and agency for those who know how to seize it. This is the new geopolitical reality the center cannot hold, and the periphery is now the cockpit of strategic innovation. The art of statecraft for nations like India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and key regional blocs like the Gulf Cooperation Council is no longer about choosing a patron. It is about mastering the art of the balance. The relentless tension between Washington and Beijing, between the Atlantic Alliance and the Eurasian powers, has created a seller's market for allegiance. These middle powers are no longer mere spectators or supporting actors. They have become the strategic swing states, the coveted prizes in a great game of influence. Their power derives precisely from their refusal to fully align, from their demonstrated ability to engage deeply with all sides. India's steadfast commitment to its relationship with Russia for defense and energy, while simultaneously deepening its strategic partnership with the United States and engaging with Europe, is not a contradiction. It is a masterclass in strategic autonomy. It provides New Delhi with leverage, ensuring that no single partner can take its cooperation for granted. This is not an isolated case, but a template. Turkey plays NATO maneuver off against advanced weapons purchases from Russia and diplomatic engagement with China. Saudi Arabia and the UAE secure their security needs from Washington while making massive energy and infrastructure investments with Beijing and Moscow. This is the new grammar of power. Multi-alignment is not indecision, it is the highest form of national strategy. This newfound agency empowers these nations pursue their regional ambitions with a freedom unseen in a generation. Unencumbered by the need to seek permission from a single hegemon, they are acting as independent poles in their own right, shaping their immediate neighborhoods according to their own interests. We see this in Turkey's assertive military and diplomatic maneuvers in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus, in Saudi Arabia's leadership within the Arab world, and in India's dominant role in the Indian Ocean. They are no longer simply following a script written in Washington or Brussels. They are authoring their own chapters in the story of their regions. The great power competition provides them with the diplomatic cover and the economic alternatives to pursue these independent paths, knowing that alienating one powerful suitor can be offset by deepening ties with another. This is the essence of strategic sovereignty in the 21st century, the ability to define one's own national interests and to have the geopolitical options to pursue them without fatal constraint. The ultimate significance of this shift, however, extends beyond the tactical gains of individual nations. Collectively, the rise of assertive middle powers and a more confident global south is the very engine of multipolarity. Their collective action, whether through expanded forums like Bureau CS+, or simply through a shared diplomatic posture of non-alignment in conflicts like Ukraine, constitutes a powerful third force in international relations. They are not building a rival bloc, but something far more transformative, a multi-vector, decentralized network of relationships that actively prevents the re-emergence of a bipolar or unipolar world. By steadfastly refusing to be partitioned into spheres of influence, they are ensuring the next global order will be flatter, more complex, and more resistant to domination by any single power. Their mission, therefore, is monumental. It is to move from being objects of great power strategy to becoming the primary architects of a new, truly pluralistic international system. The vacuum left by a receding unipolarity is not being filled by a single challenger. It is being filled by a chorus of new, confident voices, and the future will be written in the complex harmony they create. The tectonic plates of global power are shifting, and the tremors are felt in every capital around the world. The instinctive reaction for those who prospered under the old order is to resist, to pour resources into shoring up the crumbling foundations of a system that can no longer be sustained. This is a futile exercise in geopolitical nostalgia. The transition from the American-led unipolar moment to a complex, decentralized multipolar world is not a future possibility to be debated in academic journals. It is a present-day reality unfolding in real time. The energy expended on denying this transition, on clinging to the vestiges of a bygone hegemony, is energy squandered. It is a strategic dead end that can only lead to greater friction, more frequent conflicts, and a tragic failure to shape the contours of the emerging system. The defining challenge of our era is, therefore, not to resist the inevitable, but to summon the intellectual courage and strategic foresight to manage this transition intelligently. Our task is to abandon the comforting illusions of the past and build the new frameworks for competition, coexistence, and cooperation that this more complex world demands. The architecture of the 20th century is ill-suited for the challenges of the 21st. Institutions like NATO, conceived in an era of bipolar ideological confrontation, are being stretched beyond their original purpose, often exacerbating tensions rather than mediating them. The relentless logic of bloc politics, of forcing nations into binary camps, is the very fuel of the new Cold War that so many claim to want to avoid. The alternative is not a naive universalism or a world government, but a pragmatic acceptance of pluralism. This means moving beyond a system where one set of rules is dictated by a single power and toward a system built on the balance of major interests. It requires creating new platforms and revitalizing old ones to facilitate dialogue and manage conflict between these competing poles. The goal is not to eliminate competition. A world of sovereign states will always compete, but to establish resilient guardrails, to find areas of overlapping interest, such as climate change or pandemic preparedness, where pragmatic cooperation can and must occur despite broader strategic rivalries. This is the difficult, granular work of building a new international order from the bottom up. This demands a fundamental reorientation of strategic thought, particularly in the West. It requires moving from a mindset of primacy to one of equilibrium. The objective of foreign policy can no longer be the preservation of dominance, a goal that is both unattainable and provokes the very coalitions that undermine it. Instead, the focus must shift to achieving a stable balance, where the core security interests of major powers are acknowledged and respected even when they are not endorsed. This involves difficult, even painful concessions. It means accepting that spheres of influence, while unpalatable to the liberal internationalist ideal, are a persistent feature of international politics and must be managed to prevent catastrophic miscalculation. It means engaging with alternative governance models and institutions like those promoted by China and Russia, not as illegitimate challengers to be dismantled, but as reflections of different political and cultural values that will form part of the new global landscape. This is not appeasement. It is the mature recognition that durable peace cannot be built on the forced submission of other major civilizations. The call to action, then, is not for a grand universalist design, but for a generation of diplomats, strategists, and thinkers who can navigate ambiguity and complexity. The multipolar world will be messier, less predictable, and more demanding than the relative simplicity of the unipolar era. Its stability will depend on the skill of its navigators, on their ability to build bridges where others see only chasms, to de-escalate crisis through creative diplomacy, and to forge limited, interest-based agreements without the expectation of total alignment. The transition is already upon us. The question is whether we will be passive subjects of this change, buffeted by the storms of conflict it will inevitably generate, or whether we will become its active architects. Will we have the wisdom to learn from the failures of hegemony and the vision to build a world where multiple centers of power can compete, coexist, and ultimately collaborate to address the transcendent challenges that threaten us all? The energy of the old order is dissipating. Let us channel our efforts not into reviving a ghost, but into building a future that is more resilient, more just and more reflective of the world as it truly is.